Hi folks, and welcome back. This week we're going to be talking about oppression. We're going to be working to make our concept of oppression more precise by differentiating it from other ideas with which it's sometimes confused, sometimes purposefully confused, and developing an account of oppression as a kind of structural phenomenon. To do this, we're going to turn to two prominent philosophers. First, we're going to look at the work of Marilyn Frye, who gives us a structural account of oppression, a way of thinking about oppression as a kind of structural phenomenon. And then we'll turn to the work of Iris Marion Young, who fills in some of the details of this idea of structural oppression. She's going to give us an account of various facets, or she calls them faces, of oppression. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is address a kind of conceptual creep that has happened with the concept of oppression. Oppression is often used, the term oppression is often used to name things beyond the central category to which we think it ought to apply. In particular, it's been stretched in ways that make its central use somewhat less powerful. It is when we name something as oppression, we are saying something specific about it, and we are saying that it is something deeply problematic, something that needs to be addressed and redressed in some way. But if the concept is used in broad and unspecific ways, it loses this bite that it often has and that it should have, and that in fact we need it to have if we're going to use it in political projects. So what is this creep? Well, the term oppression is sometimes used to make the claim, for example, that men are just as oppressed by patriarchy as women are because men aren't allowed to express feeling. Men can't cry, we might say, or that real men don't cry. And this is a kind of oppression. Sometimes men claim that they are oppressed because they cannot find a partner when they seek one, or find the kind of partner that they are seeking out. Sometimes we hear the claim that white people are oppressed because they're not allowed to adopt certain cultural modes that are deemed appropriate for people of color, for example. And sometimes we hear claims that politically powerful groups are oppressed by the demands of political correctness, that we face a kind of oppression because we can't say what's on our minds, or we can't say what we mean. And sometimes we even hear that we even hear the claim that we're oppressed because we are required to use someone's pronouns of choice. These are what I mean by conceptual creep. So why don't these things actually count as oppression? Why aren't these matters of one's being oppressed? Marilyn Frye says that these things don't count as oppression because they aren't constraining in the way that oppression is. They aren't preventing one from acting in a variety of ways, aren't constraining one's options in the way that oppression does. Rather, they are a particular limiting of a particular option or particular mode of behavior that may cause discomfort, may cause suffering, but does not cause one to live a life that is severely limited. And when we use the term oppression to apply to these other sorts of cases, these cases where one is suffering, where one feels that one is not being properly treated, then we, as she puts it, are silenced before we begin. The name of our situation is drained of meaning, and our guilt mechanisms are tripped, because we think, oh no, I'm not I'm not oppressed. I'm the one doing the oppressing, or part of the problem. And this trips our guilt mechanisms. But she says this is nonsense. Human beings can be miserable without being oppressed. And it's perfectly consistent to deny that a person or group is oppressed without denying that they have feelings or that they suffer. So certainly, men suffer as a result of patriarchy. Men suffer because their emotional growth is stunted by patriarchal norms. Men suffer because they're forced to bear their grief, their anxiety, their depression without the support that can come from openly expressing one's emotions. But this suffering is not itself tantamount to a form of oppression. One way to start bringing out the idea of structural oppression, to start to approach this notion of oppression as a structural notion, is to focus on the idea of a double bind, or what feminists have labeled a double bind. A double bind, according to Frye, is a situation in which options are reduced to a very few, and all of them expose one to penalty, censure, or deprivation. So let's think of a few examples. One example of a double bind is the case where a woman is entering into the political sphere, trying to secure for herself a position of political power, perhaps running for the office of Senate or running for the office of the presidency. When a woman enters into such a circumstance, she faces certain social normative constraints on her behavior, certain expectations that people have of her. As someone who is seeking political office, she's expected to be someone who is assertive, who expresses her own commitments in powerful ways, who demands that her perspective be paid attention to, who tries to wield power. But as a woman, when she tries to do this, she faces censure for being too masculine, for acting in ways that men are expected to act, not women. And so she faces a kind of double bind here. If she acts in the ways appropriate to those seeking political power, then she will fail to be as feminine as she ought to be and be punished for that. But if she acts in the feminine coded ways that she is expected to act, then she will fail to secure the political power she is seeking and will be punished for being too feminine, not assertive enough. This is a kind of double bind. These normative structures by which she is surrounded constrain her behaviors in such a way that no matter what she does, she loses. Another wonderful example of a double bind is the situation of a cat call, where a man calls out to a woman on the street and tries to solicit her attention and ostensibly pays her a compliment, but in reality what he is doing is not complimenting her at all. Let's turn to Kate Mann for a brief explanation of what's going on in the circumstance of a cat call.
Although I think in the catcalling scenario, there's often a kind of double bind where there's not any way for a woman, generally speaking, to win in this scenario. It's almost like an extracurricular entitlement call, which is destined to go in one of two directions. So if she responds, she's a slut. And if she doesn't respond and kind of ignores him in some way that's, the more usual course of action, at least in my experience, she's a bitch. So it's the slut-bitch dichotomy that gets imposed in this kind of, miniature language game, to use the Wittgensteinian term, where it's like a bid for her attention, where all parties are kind of aware that this is more a bit of protest than actually trying to get her to pay him mind. But paying him mind is very much the ostensible form that this takes.
So now we've got an idea of what a double bind is, and we start to see that finding oneself in a position of oppression or being oppressed is a matter of being circumscribed by a set of constraints that limits one's options in particular ways. This is getting us now to the notion of structural oppression. So I want to start developing the idea of structural oppression in a bit more detail. The first thing that we need to do in order to get to this notion of structural oppression is switch perspectives. Normally, when we think about prejudice, when we think about oppression, we think about it from the perpetrator perspective, or we think about it in terms of what can be called the perpetrator perspective. That is, we think that what matters is an individual's own actions and what motivates those actions. Someone is racist because of the actions that they do and the motivations they have for those actions. Someone is sexist or misogynistic because of the actions that they perform and the motivations they have for those actions. The problem with the perpetrator perspective is twofold. One, that it makes it very difficult to pin down cases of sexism, of misogyny, of racism, of other forms of prejudice or oppression, because we can't see into someone's mind. We can't see into a person's heart. And if racism is a matter of what's in someone's heart, well, then we're never going to be able to identify it because we're never going to be able to take a peek there. We're always going to find ourselves arguing against the person who says, well, I didn't mean it that way. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I'd never say such a thing. I love women. I don't hate women. I love my mother and my sister. How do we argue against that? Well, we shouldn't try. The second problem with taking the perpetrator perspective on oppression or on prejudice is that it becomes a very rare phenomenon, because explicit avowals of racist sentiment or sexist sentiment are heavily frowned upon in our current society. Most people will not express those sorts of commitments explicitly, yet there still seems to be something worth naming as oppression or as prejudice. It still seems to be a prevalent force in society that helps to explain why women are paid less than men in general who do the same work, why black women are paid less than white women, why black men are incarcerated at so much higher rates than why black men are incarcerated at so much higher rates than white men are. All of these things seem to call out for a kind of explanation that can be given in terms of structural forces of oppression. To see how, we need to turn to the perspective of the oppressed rather than the perspective of the perpetrator. From the perspective of the oppressed, we can see how these structural forces, how those institutions that we identify within a society, how the norms of a society function to constrain an individual's options, function to limit what is available to them. And from this perspective, we see that an individual's actions may be racist or sexist, misogynistic or homophobic, even if they're not intended to be, even if they are well-meaning, even if they are not racist in their hearts. We all are complicit in these structures, and this comes out when we take up the perspective of the oppressed. One of the things salient to this conversation that Marilyn Frye says is that oppressed groups need not have correlative oppressor groups. So it need not be the case that there are explicitly oppressor groups and oppressed groups. There may be oppressed groups that are in those circumstances as a result of structural and institutional forces, as a result of a particular history that exists, as a result of certain social norms that are in place, when there is not a correlative group in a position of power that is clearly benefiting from these circumstances of oppression. Although someone is usually benefiting in some way, it may not be a cohesive group. So let's talk a little bit more now about what we mean by this concept of structural oppression. We can mean various things by the idea of a structure of oppression. One thing we might mean is that a certain history obtains, that there were in the past explicitly racist policies, explicitly racist programs, explicitly sexist policies or programs that created disadvantages, explicit disadvantages for people because of the particular group that they belonged to, because they were women, because they were black, because they were gay, because they were trans. They faced explicit kinds of oppression. And as a result of that history, they continue to find themselves in disadvantaged positions. So one thing we might think about here is the history of racism in the United States that goes back to a racial caste system used to enforce and support the system of slavery, and then manifested after slavery was abolished in the system of Jim Crow laws in the South that systematically disadvantaged black people. And even once the Jim Crow laws were abolished across the South, once segregation was abolished and integration became the law of the land, there continued to be kinds of disadvantage bestowed upon people of color in the form of redlining. They had difficulty seeking out loans for houses in communities where they could live. They were systematically excluded from living in particular communities, and this has all sorts of ramifications in terms of the amount of wealth they were able to accumulate or were not able to accumulate, in the kinds of education that they had access to, and the kinds of employment that they had access to. And we continue to see the ramifications of this history of racism in our society. We continue to see racially segregated communities, even though the explicit segregation is against the law. We continue to see deeply segregated school systems where schools that serve largely communities of color are significantly disadvantaged because the tax base in those communities is significantly smaller, because they have been prevented from accumulating wealth in the same way that white folks have been able to accumulate wealth over the long history of our country. So we see this sort of historical these ramifications of our history as a kind of structural oppression. Another thing we mean when we talk about structural oppression are explicit institutions, that is, explicit policies and practices that perpetuate oppressive systems. I was talking just a moment ago about redlining. This was a kind of institutional racism that was perpetrated by the U.S. government and the lending policies that they encouraged, but also perpetrated by the institution of real estate. Real estate agents would show houses in some communities to black folks and they wouldn't show, or would refuse to show houses in other communities to them. They would only show houses in certain communities to white folks. This is a kind of institutionalized racism, even though it's maybe not written into legal codes or policies. It exists as part of this institution. Another thing we mean when we talk about structural oppression is oppression that exists as a result of a particular system of social norms that we adopt. We've talked about social norms in class before. We've talked about this idea that norms are regularities of behavior that are surrounded by systems of mutual expectation. We have mutual expectations about these regularities, that people will conform with them, and where nonconformity is sanctioned. We have a regularity of sanctioning nonconformity. A system of norms such as this can sustain oppression even when it's not written into policies or legal codes, even when it's not supported by a particular institution, because we have certain expectations of the kinds of behavior that particular people will engage in because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because of or the perceived gender, because of their perceived sexual preferences. We have certain expectations of them, and when they fail to live up to those expectations, when they fail to fulfill those expectations, we engage in sanctioning behavior against them. We treat them in particular ways, shunning them, ostracizing them from our groups, or sanctioning them in other ways. And there are norms about this sanctioning behavior. If we fail to sanction people who are in violation of these kinds of social norms, then we ourselves are open to sanction for failing to engage in this sanctioning behavior. So we see these systems of norms as a source of structural oppression. And all of these exist in a kind of feedback loop with implicit and explicit biases. So we all harbor implicit biases that we have come to, we've imbibed from our culture. We've been enculturated into the adoption of certain stereotypes about various social groups, and those guide our behavior at a subconscious level in many cases, and they are the result of these sorts of structural oppressions we're talking about. It is those structural oppressions that give rise to these stereotypes, which reinforce these implicit biases, and these implicit biases then cause us to behave in ways that reinforce these structures of oppression, and explicit biases as well. Explicit biases have the same structure, only we are aware that we are acting in these ways. So now we've got a sense of what we mean by a structure of oppression, but Frye offers us now a kind of analogy for a structure of oppression that is really telling about how this structure functions to constrain an individual's options because of the social group of which they are a member. She gives us the analogy of a birdcage. She says the experience of oppressed people is that the living of one's life is confined and shaped by forces and barriers which are not accidental or occasional, and hence avoidable, but are systematically related to each other in such a way as to catch one between and among them, and restrict or penalize motion in any direction. It is the very experience of being caged in. All avenues in every direction are blocked or booby-trapped. You cannot escape. The problem is that we often take a myopic focus on individual wires or individual aspects, individual instances of oppression. And when we do so, this obscures our grasp of the structure of the whole system. So if you're focusing on an individual instance of oppression, say that someone lacks access to a good education in the neighborhood that they live in, you might think that this is avoidable, that they can evade this particular constraint on their development by moving to another neighborhood or going to a private school or seeking other educational sources to supplement their education outside of school. But this is to mistake the individual oppressive force or focus on the individual oppressive force for a view of the structure as a whole. So if someone is living in a neighborhood with poor schools and doesn't have access to a good education as a result of that, they also likely don't have access to, and their parents likely don't have access to good employment that would give them the opportunity to move to another community where they might have access to better schools. They also may not have the stored wealth that would be necessary in order to put a down payment on a home in a better neighborhood, or to even pay the first and last month's rent on an apartment in that better neighborhood. They also might not have the cultural resources, the cultural wherewithal to access certain kinds of resources to better their own education. So they may not, their parents may not know how to use the public library. They may not know that there are podcasts that are available for kids to listen to that can expand upon their educational horizons. They may not know the kinds of books that can be accessed or apps that can be accessed on a phone in order to expand someone's education. And they may not have themselves access to public transportation, because transportation is often lacking in disadvantaged communities. They may not have access to public transportation to get them to places where they can access some of these resources, like a well-stocked public library, or to places where they can access better employment than is available in the community where they live. All of these structures work together, or all of these aspects work together to form a kind of structure. So while the individual wires look avoidable, when you step back and see the whole, it's obviously confining. And for someone who's inside that cage, the truth that it's confining is incredibly obvious. They don't experience it as individual instances. They experience that whole. Individual sufferings, harms, or limitations have to be viewed then in context to determine whether they are oppressive. We can't just look at individual wires, we have to look at the whole cage. And those of us who are outside the cage, those of us who are viewing it from the outside, have trouble viewing the whole thing. We can focus on individual wires. But those who are inside, well, they don't have that luxury. Those who are inside the cage, those who are constrained by these barriers, know just how constraining it is. They have a standpoint from which they can see these constraints that we may miss. As Frye puts it, these barriers have different meanings to those on opposite sides of them, even though they might be barriers to both. The white person might be, the well-off white person might be prevented from entering the black ghetto because of fears they have for their well-being, and they might feel that they are being deprived from certain cultural resources because they can't get there. But they don't experience these, that barrier has a different meaning for them than it does for the person who is living in that ghetto and constrained by the fact that they cannot escape it. So these barriers have different meanings from each side. I'm going to stop there, cut this video, and I'll pick up in the next video with a discussion of Iris Marion Young.